Katyn is the name most often linked to the mass killing of Polish prisoners who disappeared under Soviet control during the early phase of the Second World War. It is not a story about a battlefield tragedy or a chaotic execution carried out in panic. It is a story about people taken in captivity, separated into categories, processed through a closed security system, and then removed from history with paperwork, transport lists, and silence. Thousands of families waited for letters that never came. Polish officials in exile demanded answers and received none. Years later, when graves were discovered, the case turned into an international shock and then into a long political war over responsibility, truth, and denial. The starting point is the collapse of Poland in the autumn of 1939. On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. This attack triggered the broader conflict that would soon engulf Europe. The Polish army fought, retreated, regrouped, and in many areas was overwhelmed by speed, firepower, and encirclement tactics. Then, on the 17th of September 1939, the Soviet Union entered eastern Poland with its own military forces. Poland was now caught between two powers, and its state structures began to disintegrate under pressure. Huge numbers of soldiers and officers were captured or surrendered, not only to German forces, but also to the Soviet side. From that moment, a large part of Poland's military personnel and security services became prisoners inside a system controlled by Soviet state security. What made this captivity especially important was the social makeup of the prisoners. Poland's military structure included many reserve officers who were not career soldiers. They were doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, professors, administrators, and local officials. In other words, many of the captured officers represented the educated core of Polish society, the people most capable of rebuilding state institutions in the future. Alongside them were police officers, gendarmes, border guards, and members of internal security. For Soviet leadership, these groups were not simply prisoners of war. They were viewed as politically hostile elements, a potential future leadership class that could resist Soviet control, organize opposition, or restore an independent Poland. The prisoners were concentrated in several major camps that would later become central to the Katyn case. The three most important names are Kozłowsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. Kozłowsk held mainly Polish army officers, including many from the professional and reserve officer corps. Starobelsk also held large numbers of officers and representatives of Poland's command structure. Ostashkov held many police officers, gendarmes, border guards, and other personnel the Soviet authorities considered especially dangerous. These camps were not random detention sites. They were key points in a system where people were documented, interrogated, and classified. During the winter of 1939 and the beginning of 1940, Soviet security organs conducted interviews and background checks. Prisoners were questioned about their political views, education, social status, military service, and connections. Files were built. Lists were compiled. Character assessments were written. The process looked like a filtration operation, but it did not lead toward release or exchange. The direction was different. It was about determining what to do with these prisoners as a group and whether they should be allowed to survive as a future national elite. The turning point came in early spring of 1940. According to documents later released by Soviet and Russian authorities, senior officials prepared a proposal recommending the execution of a large number of Polish prisoners held in these camps and in prisons across occupied territories. In the historical record, a key document associated with this decision is a memorandum linked to Lavreny Beria, the head of the Soviet security apparatus, sent to the Soviet leadership. The proposal argued that many of the prisoners were hardened enemies of Soviet power and should receive the highest punishment. What matters here is not the language used in the document, but the scale. The plan targeted thousands of people, not as individuals convicted in court, but as a group judged dangerous by the state. After this decision, a pattern began inside the camps that appeared, on the surface, like a normal transfer procedure. Prisoners were called by name. Groups were assembled. People were told they were being moved. Some were allowed to write letters. Many assumed they were being relocated to another camp, perhaps for exchange, labor, or further processing. But then communication stopped. Letters did not arrive. Families received no official information. Polish organizations searched for lists and requested details, but the men from these camps effectively vanished. The disappearance was not accidental. It followed a structured system. Prisoners were taken out in batches. Their identities were checked against lists. Transport was arranged. The process was controlled and repetitive. This is one reason Katyn became so explosive as a historical subject. It suggested planning at a high administrative level, not spontaneous violence. It raised questions of command responsibility. Who signed the order? Who supervised the operation? Who carried it out on the ground? Who controlled the paperwork? And who ensured that the truth was buried? In this story, Katyn is both a specific location and a broader label. Katyn Forest near Smolensk became the most famous site because it was one of the places where mass graves were later discovered. But the killings linked to this operation were not limited to one forest. Historical research connects different prisoner groups to different execution and burial sites, depending on which camp they came from. The men from Kozulsk are widely associated with the Katyn area. Other groups are linked to other locations. The point is that the operation was large, coordinated, and geographically spread across several points, while the public name Katyn became the symbol for the entire crime. Another crucial part of the Katyn case is how and when the world learned about it. For a long period, there was no confirmed information. Polish families waited. The Polish government in exile demanded answers. Nothing came. Then, in 1943, the situation changed dramatically. Nazi Germany announced that it had discovered mass graves of Polish officers in the Katyn Forest area. The Germans presented the discovery as proof of Soviet guilt. They invited international observers and attempted to use the event as a propaganda weapon against the Soviet Union and its allies. This moment turned Katyn into a global scandal because the victims were clearly identified as Polish prisoners who had been in Soviet custody. From that point forward, Katyn became not only a mass killing, but a political battlefield. The Soviet side denied responsibility and blamed Nazi Germany. Competing commissions produced competing reports. Statements were issued. Evidence was argued over. During the war, alliances and military priorities influenced how governments reacted publicly. After the war, Katyn did not disappear. It became a long-running case surrounded by fear, censorship, and geopolitical pressure. For many years, open discussion of the Soviet role was restricted in Soviet-controlled areas, while the subject remained a painful wound for Poland and for families who knew their relatives had vanished under Soviet control. Decades later, the debate shifted again as new documents emerged and official statements changed. In the late 20th century, Soviet authorities acknowledged responsibility for the executions, and later Russian institutions released further archival materials connected to the decision-making process. At the same time, the topic continued to provoke tension because Katyn was not just about the past. It was about national memory, political legitimacy, and the right to name perpetrators. It was also about the mechanics of state violence carried out behind a wall of secrecy, where thousands of lives could be ended through administrative decisions and then hidden through controlled narratives. This is why the Katyn story must be told step by step, in a strict timeline, with names, structures, and locations. In the next chapters, we will break down who exactly was imprisoned in Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, how the transfers were organized, what the documents show about the decision in early 1940, and how the execution process was carried out. We will also examine the discovery in 1943, the propaganda war that followed, and the long decades of denial and political conflict. Katyn is not a mystery in the sense of an unsolved crime. It is a case where the truth was fought over for generations, and where the consequences of a single secret decision echoed far beyond the graves themselves. To understand why the Katyn crime became possible, You have to understand what happened to Poland after the country was attacked from two sides in the autumn of 1939. The Katyn story did not begin with one sudden decision in a Soviet office. It began with the total collapse of a state, the destruction of its borders, and the capture of thousands of people who represented Poland's military and civil leadership. When Poland was divided, the Polish officer corps and security services did not simply lose a war. They became prisoners inside a system that treated them as political enemies, not as normal prisoners of war. This was the moment when the trap closed. On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The attack was fast, violent, and coordinated. Poland's forces faced overwhelming pressure and were pushed back on multiple fronts. The Polish government and military leadership tried to maintain command, but communication lines were damaged, airfields were attacked, and key transport routes were cut. The fighting was desperate in many regions, and the country was already suffering heavy losses. While Poland resisted, it was facing one of the most modern and aggressive military machines in Europe at that time. Then, on the 17th of September 1939, the Soviet Union entered eastern Poland with its own troops. The Soviet leadership claimed it was acting to protect populations in the region, but the strategic result was clear. Poland was now attacked from the west and from the east. Polish units were caught between two armies. Some attempted to continue fighting, some tried to retreat toward Romania or Hungary, and many were forced into surrender or were surrounded. A large number of Polish soldiers and officers fell into Soviet hands during these days and weeks. The capture of these men created the human foundation of the Katyn operation. In many wars, prisoners are treated as a temporary result of combat. They are held until the war ends, exchanged, or released. But the situation in eastern Poland in 1939 was different. The Soviet state did not see these prisoners only as military opponents. It saw them as representatives of a hostile political order. Poland had existed as an independent country between the world wars. It had its own army, its own police, its own courts, its own administration, and its own national identity. For Soviet leadership, especially for the security structures, a Polish officer was not only a soldier. He was a symbol of Polish statehood, discipline, and potential resistance. That is why the classification of prisoners became so important. The Soviet security apparatus separated people into categories that reflected political danger, not just military rank. Officers of the Polish army were treated as a core group. Police officers, gendarmes, border guards, and intelligence-related personnel were treated as an even more dangerous group. Civil officials, lawyers, judges, and administrators were also considered suspicious, especially if they had been involved in governing the Polish state. In other words, the Soviet system targeted the leadership layer of society, the people most capable of organizing national recovery later. This is also where the Polish reserve officer system becomes a key detail. In the Second Polish Republic, many educated civilians could become officers through training and reserve service. This meant that a large portion of captured officers were not professional military commanders. They were doctors, engineers, teachers, professors, lawyers, and civil servants. So when these men were taken into camps, the camps were filled with a cross-section of Poland's educated elite. For Soviet authorities, the long-term threat was not only armed resistance. The long-term threat was national continuity. These men could become future leaders. They could rebuild institutions. They could teach the next generation. They could restore the idea of a Polish state. The process of capture quickly turned into a process of control. Prisoners were moved into a network of camps and holding centers administered by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the Soviet security and policing system. These camps were not simple military barracks. They were controlled facilities where interrogation, documentation, and political screening could be applied systematically. The three central camps in the Katyn story became Kozlsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. The names matter because each camp held different categories, and later each camp was linked to different execution and burial locations. Kozulsk became known primarily as a camp holding Polish army officers. Starobelsk held many officers as well. Ostashkov held large numbers of police, gendarmes, border guards, and other state security-related prisoners. These camps were a mechanism of separation. By placing different groups into different locations, the Soviet system could manage them more easily, process them according to perceived danger, and control information about them. Inside these camps, prisoners lived under strict rules, limited contact with the outside world, and constant uncertainty. Many still believed that the laws of war would protect them, or that at some point a diplomatic agreement would lead to exchange or release. Some hoped they would be transferred to ordinary prisoner of war status. Others feared they would be treated as criminals or counter-revolutionaries. From the beginning, the prisoners were trying to understand what kind of captivity this was. Was it a temporary military situation, or was it a political prison with a different purpose? The Soviet side also had its own goals in the occupied territories. The occupation was not only military. It was administrative and ideological. In areas taken from Poland, the Soviet system moved to reshape political life. That included arrests of certain groups, deportations, the removal of officials, and the reorganization of institutions. These policies created an atmosphere where mass repression was already present. So the prisoners in camps were not isolated from the broader pattern. They were part of a larger strategy of control over the region and the elimination of potential opposition. During the months that followed, prisoners were interrogated and evaluated. Soviet officers and security agents conducted interviews that were not limited to military questions. They asked about political beliefs, personal history, social background, and attitudes toward the Soviet system. Files were created with detailed notes. Decisions were not made in open courtrooms. They were made through administrative procedures behind closed doors. In this environment, the word enemy could be applied broadly. It did not require an individual crime. It could be based on category, rank, education, or past service. This is where Katyn becomes a story about bureaucracy and fear. Because the murder of thousands of prisoners was not carried out by uncontrolled mobs. It was carried out through a system that used paperwork, lists, transfers, and official language to hide real intent. The structure of the camps, the categorization of prisoners, and the control of information were not accidental. They were tools. They made it possible to remove people from the system without creating visible evidence in public. At the same time, the prisoners themselves were still writing letters, thinking about families, and trying to maintain normal routines inside abnormal conditions. Many were educated, disciplined, and used a structure. They organized study groups, discussed news, and tried to keep morale alive. But the key point is that their fate was no longer in their own hands. Once a prisoner was registered inside a closed security system, he could disappear without a public trace. That was the danger of this kind of captivity. The Polish government soon ceased to exist inside the country in any meaningful form. Leaders escaped or were captured. The state apparatus was destroyed. Poland was divided, occupied, and suppressed. In such a situation, the prisoners became even more vulnerable because there was no functioning Polish authority at home that could protect them, negotiate for them, or even document their status properly. Polish diplomacy continued in exile, but the reality on the ground was shaped by the powers that controlled territory. By the end of 1939, a crucial psychological shift had occurred. The prisoners in camps realized they were not ordinary prisoners. The Soviet authorities realized they held a group that could become an obstacle to future plans. The camps became a holding zone where the Soviet side could decide the future of Poland's leadership layer without international oversight. The double occupation also created a dangerous political environment between Germany and the Soviet Union. At that stage of the war, Germany and the Soviet Union were not enemies. They were cooperating in the division of territory and influence. That meant the Soviet side felt less pressure to follow international expectations regarding prisoners. There was no active conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union in late 1939 that would force Moscow to treat Polish officers as potential bargaining material against Berlin. Instead, Soviet authorities could treat these prisoners as an internal security problem to be solved through internal methods. Another important detail is that information about the prisoners was controlled tightly. Families in Poland were overwhelmed by occupation, fear, and chaos. Communication was limited. Addresses changed. Transport and mail systems were disrupted. The camps were far away. Even when prisoners sent letters, delivery could be delayed or stopped. When letters did arrive, they often contained little clear information because prisoners themselves did not know what was coming. This uncertainty was a weapon. It kept families waiting, it reduced resistance, and it prevented organized pressure. The result was a situation where thousands of men existed inside a sealed system. They had names, ranks, and biographies. They had families. They had futures if the war ended in a certain way. But they were trapped inside a machine that could decide their fate without public visibility. This is why Chapter 2 matters. It shows that Katyn was not an isolated act. It was the logical outcome of a broader collapse and a broader occupation. Once Poland was crushed and divided, and once its leadership class was captured and categorized, the conditions were created for mass elimination. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into the camp system itself. We will examine Kozłowsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov in more detail. We will show who was held there, how the prisoners were processed, what the interrogations aimed to achieve, and why the Soviet security apparatus came to view these men as a permanent threat. This is the stage where the story shifts from occupation to decision, from captivity to planned disappearance. By the time the Polish prisoners were concentrated in the Soviet camp system, the Katyn case was no longer just about captured soldiers. It became a controlled security operation built around selection, classification, and long-term risk assessment. The three camp names that define this stage are Kozłowsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. These are not random holding areas. They were key sorting points where entire categories of Polish society were gathered, documented, interrogated, and placed under total state control. The people inside were not treated as normal prisoners of war. They were treated as politically hostile elements whose future role in Poland was seen as a threat. Kozłowsk was the camp most strongly associated with Polish army officers. Many of the prisoners were commissioned officers, including reserve officers, who had civilian careers before mobilization. This included teachers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, professors, and administrators. Their military rank mattered, but their education and social position mattered even more. The Soviet security mindset viewed these men as the leadership core of a future independent Poland. They were seen as people capable of rebuilding institutions, raising national resistance, and forming a professional cadre that could challenge Soviet control if circumstances changed. Kozłowsk, therefore, became a concentrated reservoir of Poland's military and intellectual layer. Starobelsk held many officers as well, and the profile was similar in many ways. There were professional officers and reserve officers, men connected to command structures, and people with strong educational backgrounds. Like Kozłowsk, Starobelsk represented a camp filled with potential organizers of future resistance. Even if these men were unarmed and behind barbed wire, the Soviet system did not view them as defeated opponents. It viewed them as a future danger. That perception shaped everything that followed. Ostashkov was different in its composition. It held large numbers of police officers, gendarmes, border guards, and internal security personnel. These were people connected to the enforcement side of the Polish state. They had experience in investigations, surveillance, and maintaining public order. From the Soviet point of view, this group was even more suspicious and more dangerous. The Soviet system was built around internal control and political policing. It understood exactly what police institutions could do in a society. So the Polish police and related services were treated as an enemy category that could not be trusted, re-educated, or integrated. Ostashkov, therefore, became one of the most critical sources of prisoners targeted for elimination. In these camps, daily life was structured by rules, scarcity, and uncertainty. Prisoners were housed in overcrowded conditions with limited privacy. Food was basic and rationed. Hygiene was difficult. Medical care existed, but was limited. Many men suffered from cold, fatigue, and stress. Yet despite these conditions, the prisoners tried to maintain routines. They organized discussions, taught each other languages, held informal lectures, and attempted to preserve discipline. For educated officers, routine was not only survival. It was identity. It was a way to remain human inside a system designed to reduce them to files and numbers. But the most important activity in these camps was not what the prisoners did. It was what the Soviet security apparatus did to the prisoners. From the start, the camps functioned as processing centers. Prisoners were interrogated and assessed. Soviet officers questioned them about their past service, political attitudes, social background, and loyalty. They asked about membership in political organizations, past actions against communists, and connections to polished state structures. They built psychological profiles and wrote detailed evaluations. The purpose of these interviews was not simply to gather intelligence. It was to classify people as potentially acceptable or permanently hostile. The Soviet internal security system had its own logic. It did not treat political opposition as something that could be tolerated. It treated political opposition as something that must be neutralized. The prisoners in Kozylsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov were therefore examined through a political lens. Their past careers, their education, and their national identity became evidence of hostile intent. Many prisoners were deeply patriotic and openly anti-communist. They had fought against Soviet forces in earlier conflicts or held strong beliefs about Polish independence. In a normal prisoner of war context, these beliefs would be expected. In a Soviet security context, these beliefs marked a person as an enemy. At the same time, the prisoners were cut off from reliable information. News from outside was controlled and delayed. Rumors spread through the camps. Some prisoners believed they might be released. Some believed they might be exchanged. Others feared deportation or execution. What made this period so destructive was the mixture of hope and uncertainty. In captivity, people often survive by believing there is a future. That belief was constantly destabilized by the closed nature of the system. The Soviet authorities did not explain anything. They controlled schedules, movement, and communication, leaving prisoners unable to plan, unable to resist, and unable to understand what was happening. The question of why these three camps mattered comes down to one central point. These camps contained the human structure of Poland's future. Kozylsk and Starobelsk held large numbers of officers who could become future military leadership. Ostashkov held large numbers of police and security personnel who could become future internal leadership. Together, they represented an organized layer of society with discipline, training, and authority. They were the type of men who could rebuild a national administration, command units, and coordinate resistance. If Poland ever returned as a state, these men would be essential. If the Soviet Union wanted to reshape the region permanently, these men were a problem. This is why the camp system became a tool for strategic removal. The Soviet approach was not to keep these men locked away for the whole war. The approach, as later evidence suggested, was to eliminate them as a class. It is important to understand what that means. It means the goal was not individual punishment after individual crimes. It means the goal was to remove a social and institutional layer so that the nation would be weaker, less organized, and less capable of reforming itself. This is the logic that turns captivity into extermination. Inside the camps, there were also attempts by Soviet authorities to recruit informers and to test loyalty. In any closed security environment, internal surveillance is a basic method. Prisoners could be pressured to cooperate. Some resisted completely. Some tried to navigate the danger quietly. The fear of betrayal and the fear of being singled out became part of camp life. Even without physical violence, the psychological pressure of constant uncertainty was intense. People did not know what was written about them in their files. They did not know which statements would be used against them. They did not know whether cooperation would save them or condemn them. As winter turned into early spring of 1940, new patterns began to appear. Prisoners noticed changes in camp administration. They noticed increased activity. They noticed lists being compiled more frequently. The atmosphere shifted. Transfers and movements, which had been limited, became more visible. Some prisoners were called out and disappeared from camp routines. Others saw that correspondence became more restricted. These were early signs that a major operation was being prepared. At this stage, the Soviet system was moving from classification toward implementation. The camps had done their job. They had gathered the targets in one place. They had created files. They had produced categories. They had ensured total control over communication. Now the system could act without public oversight. This is why the choice of Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov was so important. It created a clean administrative pipeline. A pipeline means there is a controlled input, a controlled process, and a controlled output. For prisoners, the output should have been release, exchange, or continued detention. In the Katyn operation, the output became disappearance. It is also important to note that the prisoners in these camps were not anonymous. Many were registered with names, ranks, and personal data. They had families that knew they were missing. In a normal wartime context, that could create pressure. But in this case, the Soviet system relied on isolation and silence. Families in occupied Poland had limited ability to organize. The Polish government in exile could protest, but it had no control over the camps. The Soviet state could simply deny, delay, and block. The existence of records inside the system did not protect the prisoners. It only made the process easier to manage. The location of the camps also mattered. They were situated far from international observers and far from public scrutiny. Transfers could happen at night. Prisoners could be moved in sealed railway cars. Documentation could be controlled. Execution sites could be chosen in remote areas. Burials could be hidden. All of this was possible because the prisoners were in a state-controlled space where every step could be managed without transparency. By the end of this chapter, the key point is clear. Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov were not just detention camps. They were the holding chambers of a planned operation. They collected the Polish officer corps, the police and enforcement structures, and the educated leadership of society in one controlled system. They allowed Soviet security organs to examine, categorize, and prepare the prisoners for removal. And once that preparation was complete, the prisoners were no longer protected by the status of captivity. They became targets in a secret process designed to eliminate them permanently. In the next chapter, we will move to the most critical decision point of the entire story. We will examine how the order was made at the highest level, how the language of the decision framed these prisoners as enemies, and how the administrative machinery of the Soviet state turned a political judgment into a mass execution operation. This is the moment when the Katyn case crosses from imprisonment into planned killing, and from secrecy into one of the most controversial historical crimes of the 20th century. By early spring of 1940, the Katyn case stopped being a question of captivity and became a question of elimination. The system had already done the preparation work. Polish prisoners had been gathered into control camps. Their identities had been recorded. Their backgrounds had been investigated. Their political danger level had been assessed through files, interrogations, and internal reports. What remained was the final step, an official decision that would turn thousands of living prisoners into a problem to be solved in secrecy. This is the chapter where the story reaches the highest level of power, because the Katyn operation was not a local initiative. It was not an accident. It was a state decision approved at the top. In the Soviet system, operations of this scale required authorization. The security apparatus could arrest, interrogate, and imprison, but the execution of thousands of people demanded political approval. That approval came through internal state mechanisms that were designed to be fast, silent, and legally closed. The key point is that the decision was framed not as a military act, but as an internal security act. The prisoners were treated not as soldiers protected by prisoner of war rules, but as enemies of the Soviet state. Once the Soviet leadership accepted that definition, the next steps became a matter of administration. The most important document associated with the decision is a proposal prepared by Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the Soviet internal security system. In the Soviet hierarchy, Beria's office controlled the NKVD, the institution responsible for policing, intelligence, internal surveillance, prisons, and camp administration. His memorandum presented the Polish prisoners as a hostile group that could not be corrected or integrated. The language used in such documents was typically bureaucratic and ideological, but the result was deadly. The proposal argued that these prisoners were hardened enemies and should receive the highest punishment. It did not call for trials, open hearings, or individual legal proceedings in public. It called for a mass administrative solution. This is one of the most chilling aspects of Katyn. The decision was not made through transparent courts. It was not debated openly. It was processed through the internal political system, where a small number of people could approve a massive killing operation in a short time. That is why the responsibility question has always focused on leadership. Because once you accept that the order came from above, the crime becomes a state act, not an uncontrolled episode of violence. The approval process involved the Soviet leadership structure that had ultimate authority in the country. In this period, real power was concentrated in a small circle at the top. Decisions were often formalized through signatures and internal resolutions that were not meant for public view. The Katyn operation, in this sense, followed the Soviet pattern of secret governance. A political decision would be made in a closed environment, and then the security system would implement it through strict discipline, chain of command, and operational secrecy. The timing is also critical. The decision is connected to early March of 1940, when the proposal was accepted and officially approved. Once that approval existed, the rest of the operation became a logistical task. The camps already contained the targeted groups. The prisoners were already isolated. The security apparatus already had transport mechanisms. The only remaining question was how to move people out of the camps in controlled waves and eliminate them without creating public traces. This chapter is not only about the signatures. It is about the logic behind the choice. Why did the Soviet leadership see these prisoners as a long-term threat? Because the prisoners were not just soldiers. They were officers, police personnel, and educated professionals. They represented the institutional structure of Poland's future. In Soviet strategic thinking, an independent Poland could become hostile again. It could align with Western powers. It could resist Soviet influence. If that happened, the men held in Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov could become the backbone of resistance and administration. Eliminating them meant weakening Poland's ability to reform itself. This is why Katyn can be understood as a targeted removal of a national elite. Not an accidental tragedy of war, but a planned political measure. The Soviet state had used similar logic internally during purges and mass operations in earlier years. The idea was always the same. Remove a category that is considered dangerous, not because of individual crimes proven in open court, but because of perceived political threat. In the Katyn case, that category was the Polish officer corps, police, and state personnel. Once the decision was approved, the next question was implementation. How does a state kill thousands of prisoners without open trials and without leaving visible evidence? The answer lies in controlled administration. The operation required lists, transport schedules, execution sites, and strict secrecy rules. It required coordination between camp administrations, NKVD field units, prison transport services, and regional authorities. It also required the elimination of paper trails that could later expose what happened. This is where the structure of the Soviet system mattered. The NKVD had the tools to do this. It controlled prisons and camps. It controlled armed units. It controlled interrogation services. It controlled secure transport. It controlled archives. The same apparatus that could arrest and deport people could also carry out mass executions in isolated areas and then bury documentation. The killing itself was only one piece. The bigger part was concealment, because concealment was what protected the leadership from accountability. The Soviet leadership did not publicly announce that these prisoners were being executed. Instead, the prisoners were removed quietly in batches. Families were not informed. Polish officials received no official confirmations. The Soviet system relied on the fact that Poland was occupied, communication was limited, and the victims were already isolated. In this environment, disappearance was easier than explanation. Silence was easier than accountability. Another critical element was the method of processing. Rather than creating a traditional court structure, the Soviet system used administrative procedures. In Soviet security practice, mass sentencing could be carried out through special internal mechanisms that allowed rapid punishment without full judicial review. The Katyn decision fit within this broader pattern. It was treated as an internal case rather than a matter requiring open legal process. That is why documentation became central. Lists were the mechanism of selection. A name on a list became a death sentence, regardless of personal circumstances. The operation also required strict discipline among those carrying it out. Large-scale secret killings are difficult to hide if too many people know the details. The Soviet system addressed this through compartmentalization and chain of command. Different units handled different stages. Camp officials handled the assembly and transfer. Transport units handled movement. Execution units handled the killing. Administrative offices handled reporting. Not everyone needed to know the full picture. They only needed to follow orders within their segment. This compartmental structure is a classic method of secrecy in state operations. At this stage, the prisoners themselves still did not understand what was happening. They were called by name. They were told they were being transferred. Many believed the transfer meant relocation, exchange, or labor assignment. Some were allowed to carry personal belongings. Some wrote short messages. This created a sense of routine. That routine was part of the mechanism. It reduced panic. It reduced resistance. It kept the process orderly. The goal was not chaos. The goal was efficiency. The question of who signed is important because it reflects responsibility. If the decision came from the highest political level, then Katyn was not the act of one unit or one officer acting independently. It was the act of the state. This is why Katyn remained dangerous for decades. Acknowledging responsibility meant acknowledging that the Soviet leadership had authorized a mass killing of prisoners. Denying responsibility meant maintaining a protective narrative. That denial, in turn, required control over information, censorship, and the creation of alternative explanations. And this is where Katyn becomes not only a crime, but a long-term battle over truth. Because once you have an order from the top, the next issue is how the truth can be buried. The Soviet system did not rely only on secrecy at the moment of the crime. It relied on secrecy for decades after. That meant hiding documents, controlling archives, punishing discussion, and maintaining an official version that blamed someone else. In the next chapter, we move from approval to execution logistics. We will follow what happened immediately after the decision was made. We will examine how prisoners began to disappear from Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, how transfers were organized, how the operation was structured step by step, and how the Soviet security apparatus ensured that thousands of men could vanish without official notification of families. This is the point where the paperwork becomes movement, and movement becomes disappearance, and the Katyn operation turns into one of the most infamous secrets of the 20th century. After the decision was approved at the top level in early March of 1940, the Katyn operation shifted from paperwork to action. At this stage, everything depended on control, routine, and secrecy. The Soviet system did not announce executions. It did not publish sentences. It did not inform families. Instead, It used a simple method that worked perfectly in a closed security state. It removed people quietly, in small groups, under the cover of normal administrative language. The prisoners were not told they were being killed. They were told they were being transferred. That single word became the doorway between captivity and disappearance. In Kozulsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, the pattern began in the spring of 1940. Prisoners were called by name. Lists were read. Men were ordered to prepare. They packed what they could. Some carried small personal items, documents, or religious objects. Many believed the transfer meant relocation to another camp, perhaps closer to home, perhaps toward a prisoner exchange, or perhaps into labor assignments. In war, transfers happened constantly, and prisoners learned to accept movement as routine. The Soviet authorities used this expectation to keep the process calm and controlled. The key fact is that the transfers were organized systematically. They were not random. They followed schedules. They were repeated day after day. Men were selected from camp rosters and moved out in batches. Once a prisoner was taken out, he did not return. As the days passed, those left behind noticed that the groups never came back, that the camp population was shrinking, and that the atmosphere had changed. Prisoners asked questions. Camp officials gave no meaningful answers. The system relied on silence, because silence prevented panic, and panic could create resistance. In Kozulsk, the departures became frequent. The prisoners were removed in successive groups, and each group disappeared into the same closed pipeline. According to widely accepted historical research, the prisoners from Kozulsk were associated with the Katyn area near Smolensk, where mass graves would later become the most famous symbol of the crime. But at this moment in spring of 1940, none of the prisoners could know that. They only knew they were being taken away, and then they were gone. In Starobelsk, the same process unfolded. Groups were called, assembled, and transported. The men disappeared from camp life with no explanation. Later research linked many Starobelsk prisoners to executions and burials in the Kharkiv region. Once again, the important point is not only where they ended up, but how the system worked. It worked like an administrative conveyor belt. Each man's name moved from a camp list into an internal transport list, and then vanished from any public record. This is how modern state secrecy kills. Not with drama, but with procedure. In Ostashkov, the operation was also executed in organized waves. The prisoners there included many police officers, gendarmes, and security-related personnel. Later evidence connected many of these men to executions in the Kalinin area, known today as Tver. Their burial site was linked to Mednoy. But again, at the time, the prisoners were simply transferred. Their families were not told anything. Their state disappeared them in the most effective way possible. By removing them from communication, removing them from lists, and leaving everyone outside the system waiting in confusion. This disappearance created a specific kind of horror because it was invisible. In many wartime tragedies, people die openly in battle or their deaths are acknowledged. In Katyn, the system did not even allow families to mourn properly because it did not confirm death. Instead, it created a black hole. Letters stopped. Names stopped appearing. Inquiries produced no clear answers. The victims were not recognized as dead, but they were no longer alive in any traceable sense. For relatives, this is the worst form of loss. Uncertainty without closure. One of the most painful parts of this chapter is the record of last communications. Many prisoners wrote letters from camps during the winter and early spring, believing they were still part of a normal prisoner of war timeline. Their letters talked about survival, health, hopes, and daily routine. They asked about family. They asked for small items. They tried to reassure loved ones. Then, at some point, the letters ended. The final messages became the last proof that these men had existed under Soviet control. When the correspondence stopped, families began to fear the truth. But fear alone was not evidence. In occupied Poland, people were dealing with violence, deportations, arrests, and terror from multiple directions. Communication systems were damaged. Mail could fail for many reasons. So for a time, many families still hoped that the prisoners had simply been relocated deeper into the Soviet Union. That hope lasted because the Soviet side provided nothing that could contradict it. At the same time, Polish institutions outside the occupied territory started to search for information. The Polish government in exile and Polish military structures formed abroad tried to track missing officers. Lists were gathered. Names were compared. Requests were made. Yet the answers from Soviet authorities were vague, delayed, or non-existent. This was not accidental. It was part of the mechanism. If you give no clear answer, you cannot be trapped by your own words. Silence is a defense. The Soviet system also understood the value of administrative normality. Camp transfers do not automatically create suspicion, because transfers happen all the time in large prison systems. The NKVD had experience moving prisoners across vast distances. Trains were used routinely. Prisoners were transported in sealed conditions. Records were controlled internally. The same machinery used for deportations and internal repression could be used for this operation without attracting outside attention, especially during wartime chaos. This is also the moment when the victims became separated from each other permanently. In camps, prisoners lived in shared conditions, shared information, shared rumors. They could support each other psychologically. Once transferred out, they were isolated into smaller groups controlled by guards, moved through stations and facilities where nobody could witness the full process. Isolation is critical in secret operations. It prevents collective resistance. It reduces the number of surviving witnesses. It makes the victims easier to control. Another important point is that the operation did not require public violence to achieve obedience. The prisoners were already in captivity. They were already conditioned to follow orders. They were already dependent on the system for food and movement. In such conditions, even a deadly operation can proceed with minimal physical struggle, because the victims are guided by routine and by hope. Many still believed that transfer meant survival. The Soviet side did not need to convince them with speeches. It only needed to move them step by step, from camp to transport, from transport to detention facility, and from detention facility to the final stage. The disappearance also created a massive administrative void. After spring of 1940, thousands of Polish families had no confirmed knowledge of where their relatives were. Polish organizations were missing a large part of their officer corps. Entire units had lost commanders. Entire communities had lost doctors, teachers, lawyers, and officials. In terms of national structure, this was not only a human tragedy. It was a strategic weakening. Poland was losing a layer of leadership that could have rebuilt the country after war. This is why the Katyn operation must be understood as more than killing. It was removal. It was elimination of capacity. It was the destruction of institutional memory. And it was done through a method that left families and officials trapped in uncertainty. The victims did not vanish in a public catastrophe. They vanished inside a controlled administrative process that made the crime harder to prove and easier to deny. As weeks passed, the silence became impossible to ignore. By late spring and summer, the lack of letters, the lack of official lists, and a lack of clear answers created a growing suspicion among Poles that something catastrophic had happened. But suspicion still was not evidence. Evidence would come later, through graves, documents, and investigations. At this stage, the Soviet system still believed the secret could hold, because the bodies were hidden, the paperwork was locked away, and the world was focused on the wider war. This chapter ends with a simple reality. In the spring of 1940, thousands of Polish prisoners were taken out of Kozłsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, and they disappeared. They did not appear in new camps. They did not return. Their families were given nothing. Their government received no confirmed records. The Soviet system had completed the most dangerous part of the operation. It had removed the victims from the visible world. In the next chapter, we move to the location that became the symbol of the entire crime, the Katyn Forest. We will examine why that area became connected to the Kozłsk prisoners, how the execution sites were selected, how the operation was carried out behind closed doors, and why the physical evidence was hidden in a way that later turned Katyn into an international scandal. This is where disappearance becomes fact, where silence is broken, and where the world begins to approach the truth through what was left underground. By the time the spring transfers were underway in 1940, the Katyn operation was no longer hidden inside camps. It had moved into its final stage, where the Soviet security apparatus could carry out mass killings in controlled conditions and erase the traces before anyone outside the system could intervene. This chapter focuses on the location that later became the symbol of the entire crime: the Katyn Forest near Smolensk. It is important to understand that Katyn was not a random place chosen by chance. It was selected because it offered exactly what a secret operation needed: isolation, state control, and the ability to bury evidence quickly. The Smolensk region was under Soviet control, far from international observers, and far from the front line at the time. The area included forests, restricted zones, and NKVD facilities that could be used to conduct closed operations without public visibility. In such environments, the state could move prisoners, keep civilian witnesses away, and secure execution and burial sites behind a wall of secrecy. This is why Katyn became linked so strongly to the prisoners from Kozulsk. The system needed a reliable location where transport routes were manageable and where the final stage could be conducted efficiently, repeatedly, and without disruption. The operation followed a logic that was designed to reduce risk. The prisoners were not transported in one massive convoy that could attract attention. They were moved in waves, in controlled numbers, through an internal pipeline. A prisoner's name moved from camp lists to transport lists, then into regional NKVD custody. From that point, the process was handled by units trained in secrecy and discipline. The key feature was compartmentalization. Different people handled different steps. Camp officials managed the departures. Transport units managed the movement. Regional NKVD units handled the final stage. This ensured that no single layer of the system needed to explain the entire operation, and it reduced the number of people who could later describe the full picture. When prisoners left Kozulsk, they were taken by rail toward the Smolensk area. From there, they were moved by smaller transports toward the execution zone. The victims were kept under guard and isolated. They were prevented from communicating with local civilians or with other prisoner groups. They were treated not as prisoners in a normal administrative transfer, but as targets being moved through a controlled procedure. The system did not want confusion, noise, or delay. It wanted order. Order was part of concealment. Historical research and later archival evidence suggest that the killing method was standardized. The security system preferred methods that were fast, contained, and repeatable. The goal was not to produce a public spectacle. The goal was to eliminate a human group with minimal disruption. In such operations, the victims are brought in small groups, processed quickly, and removed from the living world without leaving a trail that families or institutions could follow in real time. What makes Katyn terrifying is that it combined mass scale with administrative calm. A crime can be enormous and still be executed with bureaucratic discipline. Once executions were completed, the next task was burial. Burial is the second half of secrecy. Without hidden graves, the Soviet authorities could have continued denying everything more easily. The victims were buried in mass graves and forest soil. The site offered natural cover and distance from population centers. It allowed the operation to be conducted repeatedly without immediate discovery. The burial process was not only about disposal. It was about preventing identification. It was about hiding the number of victims. It was about removing the possibility of witness testimony. At this stage, the Soviet system assumed that time would protect the secret. The war was expanding across Europe. The world's attention was focused on major battles, occupations, and survival. Poland was divided and under brutal control. Families could not travel freely. International investigators could not enter Soviet territories. The Soviet state controlled information and could deny any accusations without facing immediate consequences. From a security perspective, The operation was designed to disappear into the noise of war. But even the best-controlled secret has weaknesses. In Katyn, the weakness was the physical fact that thousands of bodies exist in one area. A mass grave is a time bomb. It can remain hidden for years, but if the territory changes hands, or if local people discover clues, the truth becomes harder to bury. That is why the Katyn case later exploded internationally. Not because the crime was unique in its cruelty, but because the evidence survived underground, waiting for political circumstances to shift. To understand Katyn properly, you also have to understand what it meant in strategic terms. The victims were not random. Many were officers, intellectuals, and state personnel. Their elimination removed leadership capacity from Poland. It destroyed military experience. It erased police and administrative expertise. It shattered families and communities. This was not only murder. It was structural damage. It was a calculated reduction of a nation's ability to rebuild its institutions. When you remove thousands of educated men, you do not only remove individuals. You weaken the future. The Katyn forest became the primary symbol because of what would happen later, but even in 1940, it served as the endpoint of a system that treated human beings like a file to be closed permanently. The Soviet authorities could label these prisoners enemies, process them without trials, and end their lives in secrecy. The operation did not need open ideology speeches. It needed only orders, logistics, and silence. That is why responsibility became such a dangerous topic. Because the final stage of the operation required deliberate coordination, and deliberate coordination points back to the state. It is also important to recognize the psychological mechanism that helped the operation move smoothly. Many prisoners likely still believed, until the last moment, that they were being transferred to another camp or another administrative destination. The Soviet system had used that belief as a tool. It reduced resistance. It made the victims easier to control. It prevented collective panic. In secret operations, fear can be dangerous for the perpetrators because fear can lead to chaos. The Soviet system preferred routine. Routine was safer. Meanwhile, outside the Soviet Union, the Polish side continued to search for missing officers. Families waited for letters. Polish officials in exile demanded answers. But the Soviet authorities could simply delay and deny. The victims had vanished from communication. No confirmed deaths were recorded publicly. The people were simply gone. This is where Katyn became a case of double destruction. The destruction of lives and the destruction of information. If you kill someone and also erase their trail, you can control how history speaks about them. The secrecy around Katyn also shaped later events. When the graves were eventually discovered in wartime conditions, the case did not appear as a normal crime investigation. It appeared as a political weapon. That was inevitable. A mass grave discovered during a global war would always be used for propaganda. The question was not only what happened, but who would be blamed, who would be believed, and how governments would respond. This is why Katyn became one of the most controversial and explosive historical disputes of the 20th century. But in 1940, inside the Soviet system, the assumption was simple. The operation was complete. The prisoners from Kozulsk had been removed. The evidence was buried. The paperwork was controlled. Families had no answers. The world was distracted by war. The Soviet leadership believed the crime could remain sealed forever. That confidence would not last. Because history has a habit of reopening buried truth when politics changes, when armies move, and when the ground itself becomes evidence. In the next chapter, we will move to the year 1943, when the situation changed dramatically. The Smolensk region came under German control, and the mass graves were revealed. From that moment, Katyn stopped being only a hidden crime and became an international scandal. Germany would use the discovery to attack the Soviet Union. The Soviet side would deny responsibility and accuse Germany. Commissions would be formed, reports would be written, and the truth would be fought over like a battlefield. Chapter 7 is where Katyn becomes global, where secrecy collapses, and where the story turns into a war over evidence itself. In 1943, the Katyn case stopped being a hidden crime and became an international weapon. For nearly 3 years, the Polish prisoners taken from Kozlsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov had vanished into silence. Families received no letters. Polish officials abroad could not locate their missing officers. The Soviet authorities provided no clear information and maintained a wall of denial. Then the military situation on the Eastern Front changed. Territory shifted. Control of the Smolensk region moved into German hands. And once that happened, the secret underground was no longer protected by Soviet power. The bodies were still there. The graves were still there. And in war, a mass grave is not only evidence. It is ammunition. The German occupation of the Smolensk area created the conditions for discovery. The Germans began to search and document the region. They had their own interests, their own intelligence goals, and their own propaganda strategy. When the mass graves in the Katyn forest were revealed, the German leadership immediately understood the value. Thousands of dead Polish officers, clearly linked to captivity under Soviet control, could be used to damage the Soviet Union's reputation and to fracture the alliance between Moscow and the Western powers. Germany did not discover Katyn in a neutral context. It discovered Katyn in the middle of a total war where every fact could be turned into a battlefield advantage. In April of 1943, German authorities publicly announced the discovery of mass graves near Katyn. They presented it as proof that the Soviet Union had executed Polish officers. They released statements, arranged press coverage, and started organizing inspections. The purpose was not only to reveal the truth. The purpose was to control the narrative and to isolate the Soviet Union politically. Germany wanted to present itself as the side exposing a communist crime, while ignoring its own mass killings across Europe. This created an immediate problem for everyone watching. The evidence looked real and shocking, but the messenger was also a regime known for lies, terror, and extermination. That contradiction shaped the entire battle that followed. To strengthen their position, the Germans invited international observers and attempted to give the discovery a formal appearance. They supported the creation of a medical and forensic investigation process that could be displayed as professional. They also tried to involve representatives from countries under German influence and to bring in outside witnesses. The core German argument was simple. The victims were Polish officers. They had been in Soviet custody after 1939, and their deaths occurred before the German occupation of the region. If the dates could be established, Germany could frame the Soviet Union as the perpetrator and force a political crisis inside the Allied camp. At the same time, the Polish government in exile faced an impossible decision. Polish leaders had been searching for their missing officers for years. They suspected something terrible had happened, but they had no confirmed proof. Now a mass grave was being presented publicly, with names and evidence. For Poland, the question was not only historical. It was personal, national, and immediate. Thousands of Poland's most important military and educated men had vanished. If the graves were real, then Poland's leadership class had been erased. The Polish government in exile demanded an independent investigation, and it appealed to the International Committee of the Red Cross to examine the graves and determine responsibility. This request triggered a political explosion. The Soviet Union reacted with rage and aggression. Moscow denied responsibility completely and accused Germany of committing the massacre. The Soviet narrative was that the Germans had executed the prisoners after capturing the region in 1941. The Soviet authorities framed the German announcement as a propaganda attack designed to weaken the Allies. This denial was not mild or cautious. It was absolute. It was backed by state power. And it was delivered at a moment when the Soviet Union needed unity from its allies against Germany. The conflict escalated quickly because of one key reality. The Allied coalition was built on military necessity, not trust. Britain and the United States needed the Soviet Union to keep fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. Millions of soldiers were engaged. The war's outcome depended on it. That meant that a public rupture between Poland and the Soviet Union, or a wider diplomatic breakdown, threatened strategic goals. Katyn was not just a tragedy. It was a political grenade thrown into the middle of a fragile alliance. When Poland pushed for independent investigation, the Soviet Union responded by breaking diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile. This was a critical turning point. It showed that Katyn was not a minor dispute. It was a matter the Soviet leadership treated as an existential threat to its credibility. If the Soviet Union accepted responsibility, it would admit to executing Allied officers. It would expose the nature of its internal security state. It would create long-term political damage. So the Soviet choice was confrontation and denial. From that moment, two versions of Katyn were launched into history, and each version was defended like a military position. The German version said the Soviets killed the prisoners in 1940. The Soviet version said the Germans killed the prisoners in 1941. Both sides produced claims, documents, witness statements, and commissions. Both sides used the discovery for strategic messaging. The victims, who had already been eliminated in secrecy, now became tools in a propaganda war between two regimes capable of massive crimes. The battle over dates became central. If the deaths occurred in 1940, the Soviet Union was responsible. If the deaths occurred in 1941, the Germans could be blamed. Establishing timing is often the key in forensic investigations. In Katyn, timing became the key in political warfare. Germany attempted to show that the victims' bodies and personal effects supported a 1940 timeline. The Soviets insisted the deaths happen later. Both sides understood that controlling the timeline meant controlling the verdict. The Soviet Union formed its own official commission and presented its own findings. This was not an independent investigation in the Western sense. It was a state-directed process built to support the state narrative. The commission claimed that German forces were responsible and that the execution had taken place under German occupation. It presented witnesses and evidence to match this version. For Soviet propaganda, Katyn became an example of German barbarity. Any alternative view was treated as hostile, dangerous, or treasonous. Meanwhile, Western governments were caught in the middle. They had access to information and intelligence that raised serious questions. They also had political pressure to maintain the alliance with Moscow. The result was a pattern of public caution and private awareness. Britain and the United States often avoided making definitive public statements that could fracture wartime cooperation. The war against Germany was the immediate priority. This created a situation where the truth of Katyn could be suspected by many, but officially left unresolved or avoided in the name of strategy. For Poland, this was a disaster on multiple levels. Poland was fighting for survival as a nation, with its territory occupied and its population suffering. Its officer corps had been destroyed, and now its government in exile was being punished diplomatically for demanding an investigation into the murder of its own people. Katyn therefore became a symbol not only of loss, but of abandonment. Polish leaders were forced to realize that the great powers could prioritize wartime goals over Polish justice. The German strategy was also clear. Germany did not expose Katyn because it cared about Polish victims. Germany exposed Katyn because it wanted to break the Allied alliance, weaken Soviet moral authority, and encourage anti-Soviet sentiment in Europe. It was an attempt to create political division and to recruit support through outrage. The cynical reality was that Katyn was being used by a regime that was committing its own mass exterminations across the continent. This is why Katyn became so complex. The evidence of Soviet crime was being revealed by Nazi Germany, which was itself a central engine of genocide that made the moral landscape confusing for outside observers and easy to manipulate. Inside occupied Europe, the Katyn news spread rapidly. For many Poles, it confirmed the worst suspicions. For others, it created fear because speaking about Soviet guilt could bring punishment. The Soviet narrative would dominate in territories controlled by the USSR, while alternative discussion could be banned. In Germany and German-controlled zones, the story would be amplified to maximize anti-Soviet anger. Katyn therefore entered public consciousness through a propaganda framework, rather than through neutral justice. This is why 1943 is the year when Katyn becomes more than a mass grave. It becomes a permanent international dispute. The crime itself had already been committed. What changed was visibility. Once the graves were opened, the dead could no longer be denied completely. The question became who could control interpretation, who could control investigation, and who could control memory. And in wartime, memory is a strategic resource. Even after 1943, the Katyn case did not settle into clarity. It continued into the post-war era, where political realities shaped which version was permitted and which version was suppressed. In the Soviet sphere, blaming Germany became official doctrine. In the West, the subject remained controversial, partly because governments had wartime reasons for caution and post-war reasons for geopolitical stability. For Poland, the wound remained open. The families of victims wanted names, responsibility, and truth. What they received instead was decades of argument and silence. Chapter 7 ends with the core reality. In 1943, Katyn became global. The graves were no longer a hidden secret. They were a political event. Germany used the discovery as a weapon. The Soviet Union responded with total denial and counter-accusation. Poland demanded an investigation and was punished diplomatically. Western allies avoided open confrontation for strategic reasons. The dead became the center of a war over truth, and the result was a historical conflict that would last for generations. In the next chapter, we move into the decades after the discovery. We will examine how the Soviet narrative was enforced, how the subject was censored, how families were pressured into silence, and how Katyn remained a forbidden truth across much of Eastern Europe. This is where the killing ends and the long-term cover-up begins, turning Katyn into not only a massacre, but a state-managed lie that shaped memory, politics, and fear for decades. After the graves were exposed in 1943, Katyn became more than a mass killing. It became a long-term battle over narrative control. The dead were already buried, but the truth about who killed them was not allowed to live. This chapter is about how the Soviet system managed the Katyn story for decades, how denial was built into state policy, how propaganda replaced investigation, and how fear and censorship turned Katyn into one of the most forbidden subjects in Eastern Europe. Katyn was not only hidden in the ground. It was hidden in archives, in state language, and in the silence imposed on families. The Soviet position after 1943 was clear and absolute. Moscow denied responsibility and blamed Nazi Germany. The official narrative claimed that the Polish prisoners had been killed by German forces after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. This version was repeated through Soviet media, government statements, and official commissions. It was not presented as a theory or a disputed claim. It was presented as fact. In a system where the state controlled information, the official version became the only version allowed to exist publicly. The Soviet denial was not simply a defensive reaction. It became a strategy of power. Accepting responsibility for Katyn would have had massive consequences. It would have acknowledged that Soviet leadership authorized the execution of thousands of prisoners. It would have exposed the methods of the NKVD. It would have destroyed Soviet claims to moral authority during and after the war. It could have weakened Soviet influence in Poland and across Eastern Europe. It could have created international condemnation and internal political risk. So denial was not optional. It was necessary for the Soviet political system. During the final years of the war, the Soviet Union regained control over the Katyn area as front lines shifted. Once the territory was under Soviet authority again, the Soviet system could reassert full control over investigation, documentation, and public discussion. The state could restrict access to the site. It could classify documents. It could decide which witnesses were heard and which were silenced. It could shape the historical record through institutions that served political goals rather than independent truth. This is one reason why Katyn remained unresolved in public terms for so long. The state held the archives, controlled the courts, controlled the press, and controlled the space where evidence could be examined. After the war ended, the political situation in Poland changed completely. Poland fell into the Soviet sphere of influence, with a communist government supported by Moscow. That meant the Katyn narrative was not only controlled inside the Soviet Union, it was also controlled inside Poland itself. Speaking openly about Soviet responsibility became dangerous. The topic could be treated as anti-Soviet propaganda. It could be treated as hostility toward the communist state. It could bring surveillance, punishment, or career destruction. In such conditions, even families of victims were forced to speak carefully or remain silent. The Katyn denial became a core element of post-war propaganda. The Soviet system portrayed itself as the liberator of Europe from fascism, and it presented Nazi Germany as the ultimate criminal enemy. This broader narrative was true in many respects, because Nazi Germany did commit immense atrocities. But the Soviet leadership also used that truth as a shield. It used Germany's crimes to block discussion of Soviet crimes. If Germany was the obvious monster, then accusations against the Soviet Union could be dismissed as Nazi lies or Western manipulation. Katyn became trapped inside this propaganda framework. This denial was reinforced by institutional mechanisms. Archives were sealed. Documents were classified. Researchers were limited. Journalists could not investigate freely. Schools and official histories repeated the state narrative. Public memorials were controlled. Courts did not examine Soviet responsibility. Even mentioning the possibility of Soviet guilt could be treated as a hostile political act. In a closed system, the state did not need to argue with alternative views. It could erase them. For the families of victims, this created a second tragedy. The first tragedy was the loss of their relatives. The second tragedy was being forced into silence about how it happened. Many families knew or strongly suspected the truth based on disappearance patterns and wartime information. But knowing privately and speaking publicly are two different things under a security state. People could be watched. Letters could be intercepted. Careers could be destroyed. Entire lives could be shaped by fear. This is how denial becomes not just a political line, but a personal prison. Katyn also became a symbol of the broader Soviet approach to historical control. The Soviet state did not tolerate narrative uncertainty on sensitive topics. It demanded ideological unity. That meant the Katyn story had to be fixed, simplified, and closed. The official story blamed Germany. The official story positioned the Soviet Union as innocent. The official story turned the massacre into another example of Nazi cruelty. That framing was repeated until it became institutional truth. Internationally, the issue remained unresolved for many years, partly because of wartime alliances and post-war geopolitics. After the war, the world entered the Cold War era. Relations between the Soviet Union and Western powers were tense and strategic. The West had reasons to highlight Soviet abuses, but it also had reasons to maintain certain diplomatic structures. Katyn became part of a wider information war, where each side accused the other of crimes and manipulation. In this environment, achieving a single globally accepted narrative was difficult. Evidence existed, but political conditions shaped how that evidence could be used. One of the key moments in the Western context was the creation of investigations and discussions outside Soviet control. Over time, independent historians, Polish communities abroad, and Western institutions continued to study the case. They gathered testimonies, compared documents, and analyzed evidence. The idea that the Soviets were responsible did not disappear. It survived in exile communities, academic work, and private memory. Katyn became a wound carried by people who were not allowed to speak freely inside their own country. Inside Poland, the communist government supported the Soviet narrative officially, but Polish society did not forget. Katyn remained a whispered truth. It was discussed privately. It survived in families. It existed in underground memory. Even when public speech was forbidden, private memory continued. This is why Katyn remained so powerful. It was not only a political dispute. It was a national trauma reinforced by enforced silence. The Soviet system also understood the danger of documents. Paper can destroy denial. This is why the most sensitive evidence was locked away. Internal NKVD records, leadership memoranda, transport lists, and execution approvals were not available to the public. A closed archive allows a state to control history. If researchers cannot access primary sources, they cannot prove responsibility in a way that forces official change. The Soviet state relied on this. As long as the archives were sealed, denial could remain a policy. The propaganda war over Katyn also created a distorted environment where truth and manipulation were constantly mixed. Nazi Germany had used Katyn in 1943 for political advantage. The Soviet Union used denial for political advantage. That meant many people outside the region viewed Katyn through the lens of propaganda rather than evidence. Some dismissed it as wartime psychological warfare. Others believed it strongly but lacked documents to convince governments. The victims became trapped in competing narratives that were shaped by power, not by justice. As decades passed, Katyn became a test of historical honesty. It raised questions about whether states can admit crimes committed under secret orders. It raised questions about whether alliances can survive moral scandal. It raised questions about whether families can ever receive closure when a government controls archives. The Soviet system answered these questions with the same tool. Control. Control of speech. Control of publishing. Control of education. Control of memorialization. Control of law. By the 1970s and 1980s, the pressure on the Soviet system began to change slowly. The world was changing. Historical research expanded. Polish opposition movements grew stronger. Underground publishing existed. Polish society demanded more control over its own memory and identity. Katyn remained one of the most sensitive topics because it represented the point where Soviet power had killed Poland's elite and then demanded silence about it. The longer the denial lasted, the more Katyn became a symbol not only of murder, but of humiliation. Chapter 8 ends with a clear conclusion. The Soviet system did not merely deny Katyn once. It built denial into decades of state policy. It used censorship and propaganda to block truth. It pressured society to stay silent. It sealed archives to prevent proof. And it turned a mass killing into a political myth designed to protect leadership. But secrets do not remain stable forever. Pressure accumulates. Documents survive. Families remember. Political systems change. And eventually, the wall that protects denial begins to crack. In the next chapter, we will move to the collapse of that wall. We will examine the moment when Soviet authorities began to acknowledge responsibility, how documents started to emerge, what was revealed about the decision-making process, and why the Katyn issue became one of the most dramatic examples of late 20th century historical disclosure. Chapter 9 is where denial weakens, archives open, and the truth becomes impossible to suppress. For decades, Katyn existed in two parallel realities: in private memory, in Polish families, and in independent historical research outside Soviet control. The belief that the Soviet security system carried out the executions remained strong. In the official Soviet narrative, responsibility was placed on Nazi Germany, and any alternative was treated as hostility or dangerous propaganda. This contradiction could survive only as long as the Soviet system remained powerful enough to control archives, speech, and education. But by the late 20th century, the political environment began to change. The Soviet Union entered a period of crisis, reform, and weakening authority. And once that happened, Katyn became one of the most explosive truths waiting behind closed doors. Chapter 9 is the moment when denial starts to break, when the state can no longer fully control history, and when official recognition becomes unavoidable. The shift did not happen overnight. It developed over years through political pressure, social change, and the growing collapse of Soviet credibility. By the 1980s, the Soviet system faced deep problems. Economic stagnation, social distrust, political exhaustion, and rising resistance inside the Eastern Bloc. In Poland, opposition movements pushed against communist control and demanded national sovereignty, free speech, and the right to tell the truth about the past. Katyn was not a minor historical dispute in this context. It was a symbol of Soviet domination, and the forced silence around it became a symbol of humiliation. The more polished society demanded truth, the more Katyn turned into a test of whether the system could remain legitimate. At the same time, international research continued. Historians, exiled Polish communities, and Western institutions collected testimonies, analyzed available documents, and compared timelines. The evidence pointed increasingly towards Soviet responsibility. But the strongest proof remained locked behind Soviet archives. Without access to internal NKVD paperwork and leadership-level documents, the debate could always be framed as political argument rather than confirmed state responsibility. That is why the archive mattered. The archive was the fortress protecting denial. Everything changed when the Soviet leadership began a policy of openness and reform, known widely as a shift toward greater transparency in public discussion. This environment allowed previously forbidden topics to surface. The Soviet state still tried to control the process, but the old level of censorship weakened. In this atmosphere, Katyn returned to public conversation with growing force. The question was no longer only what Polish families believed. The question became what the Soviet state would officially admit. Poland pushed the issue hard. For the Polish side, Katyn was not only about historical justice. It was about national dignity. The victims were not abstract numbers. They were officers, police personnel, intellectuals, and civil servants whose removal shaped the entire post-war future of Poland. Their families had lived for decades under silence. A state-managed lie had controlled their grief. By the end of the communist era, Poland demanded not only sympathy, but acknowledgement of responsibility and the release of documents. As the Soviet Union weakened, denying Katyn became more dangerous than admitting it. Denial required constant propaganda enforcement. It required the continued suppression of researchers and public voices. It required the maintenance of a narrative that was increasingly difficult to defend as new evidence accumulated. Admitting responsibility, however, carried its own cost. It would expose the Soviet leadership's role in authorizing mass executions. It would damage Soviet moral claims. It would provoke political fallout. But the Soviet system was entering a stage where controlling the truth was becoming impossible. The state could still delay, but it could not erase. Official admissions began to emerge at the highest level. Soviet authorities acknowledged that the executions were carried out by the Soviet internal security system. This was a historic reversal. For decades, the official line blamed Germany. Now, the state itself was admitting that its previous version had been false. This was not simply a correction. It was the collapse of an entire propaganda structure that had lasted through war and Cold War. For Poland, it was a breakthrough. For the Soviet system, it was an admission that state policy had been built on deception. But admission alone was not enough. The real power was in the documents. In historical crimes, words can be denied later. Paper is harder to destroy when it survives. The Katyn case involved internal memoranda, approvals, lists, and administrative records. When such materials began to be released, they transformed the issue from political debate into documentary history. It became harder for anyone to claim uncertainty about who ordered what. It became a matter of records, signatures, and state procedure. Among the most important revelations were documents connected to the decision-making process at the top. These materials pointed to a direct connection between the security leadership and the highest political authorities. They indicated that the executions were not a local act. They were not a battlefield event. They were an authorized operation carried out through centralized approval. This is why Katyn remains one of the most loaded crimes in modern European history. It is linked not only to violence, but to governance, because it shows how a state can administratively approve mass killing and then hide it behind decades of denial. The release of documentation also clarified how the operation was structured. It was connected to the three major camp groups: Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. The victims were processed through a system of lists and transfers. The killings were carried out in different locations depending on the prisoner group. The crime was coordinated across regions. This structure supported the conclusion that Katyn was a planned operation with operational discipline, not a spontaneous act. The bureaucratic nature of the system became visible through paperwork. However, even after admissions and document releases, Katyn did not become a simple closed case. That is because historical truth is one thing, and political reconciliation is another. Admission opened new questions. Who exactly was responsible within the chain of command? What institutions carried it out? How many victims were killed? Which documents were still missing? Which names were still not confirmed? Which files remained classified? In other words, admitting guilt did not automatically produce full transparency. It produced a new battlefield, the fight over how much truth would be allowed and how it would be framed. For Poland, Katyn also remained emotionally charged because of the decades of silence and pressure. Families had lived with enforced denial. Many have been punished or threatened for speaking about it. Some have been forced to accept the German blame narrative publicly, even when they did not believe it privately. This creates a specific kind of trauma. Not only grief, but the feeling of being forced to lie about your own dead. When admission finally came, it brought relief, but also anger, because it confirmed that the silence had been political, not accidental. The Soviet and later Russian approach to Katyn also became complicated by changing politics after the fall of the Soviet Union. When a state transforms, it often struggles with the crimes of its predecessor. Admission can happen during one political era, then be softened or reframed later under different leadership priorities. Katyn entered this unstable space. The documents existed, but the politics around them could shift. The question became whether the truth would be fully integrated into official memory, or whether it would remain a contested subject influenced by nationalism and geopolitical tension. Another critical issue was legal responsibility. Families and institutions wanted more than historical recognition. They wanted formal legal treatment of the crime. They wanted names and accountability. But legal processes involving state crimes are difficult, especially when decades have passed and the responsible institutions no longer exist in the same form. Even when documents are released, full legal closure may not follow. Katyn became an example of how historical truth can be acknowledged while legal justice remains incomplete. The admission period also exposed another reality. Denial had not been maintained only by censorship. It had been maintained by fear of the consequences of truth. Once the state admits a crime like Katyn, it raises questions about other crimes. It weakens the mythology of moral purity. It forces society to confront uncomfortable facts about its own institutions. That is why Katyn became a gateway topic. It symbolized not just one massacre, but the larger mechanism of secret violence inside a political system. Chapter 9 is therefore not only the story of disclosure. It is the story of pressure breaking a wall. It shows how families, historians, and political change can force the state to admit what it tried to erase. It shows how archives can destroy propaganda. It shows how the dead can return to history through documents. And it shows that denial can last for decades, but it is not invincible when evidence survives. This chapter ends with the central outcome. The Soviet system officially admitted responsibility for the Katyn executions and began releasing crucial documents that linked the crime to the security apparatus and top-level approval. The lie that had dominated for decades was finally cracked. But Katyn did not become a quiet chapter of the past. It remained active, emotional, and politically powerful, because even after admission, questions of full transparency, memory, and accountability continued to shape relations, identity, and national trauma. In the next and final chapter, we will bring the story into the present. We will examine how Katyn is remembered today, how it continues to influence politics and national memory, and why it remains one of the most sensitive historical subjects in Europe. Chapter 10 is the long shadow of Katyn, the legacy of the massacre, the cost of denial, and the reason the truth still matters decades later. Katyn did not end with the executions in 1940, and it did not end with the discovery of the graves in 1943. It did not even end with official admissions decades later. Katyn continues to exist today because it is more than a historical crime. It is a national wound, a political symbol, and a permanent test of how states handle uncomfortable truth. This final chapter explains why Katyn remains so sensitive, why it still shapes relationships and identity, and why the memory of what happened continues to provoke tension, debate, and emotion across borders. The most basic reason Katyn still matters is that it was not simply the death of individuals. It was the destruction of a leadership layer. The victims were officers, police personnel, officials, and educated professionals. They represented experience, organization, discipline, and national structure. Their removal weakened Poland at the moment when the country's future depended on survival, rebuilding, and continuity. When a nation loses thousands of people who form its institutional backbone, the damage continues long after the bodies are buried. Katyn was an assault on the future, and that is why its consequences stretched across decades. Katyn also became inseparable from the larger history of Poland during and after the Second World War. Poland suffered under brutal occupation, mass killings, deportations, and destruction. When the war ended, Poland did not regain full sovereignty in the way many hoped. It fell under Soviet influence, and the communist system dominated political life for decades. In that environment, Katyn became the ultimate symbol of controlled memory. It represented a moment when Poland's elite was destroyed, and then the survivors were told to accept an official lie about it. This combination of loss and humiliation created a trauma that did not fade. It became part of national identity. For families, Katyn remained personal. It was not an abstract debate about history books. It was the absence of a father, a brother, a husband, a grandfather. It was the empty chair at family gatherings. It was unanswered questions. It was the pain of not knowing for sure, then the pain of knowing but being forbidden to speak. Even after admission, family trauma does not disappear instantly. It stays in memory and passes between generations. That is why Katyn commemorations are not simply ceremonies. They are acts of emotional recovery and public dignity. Modern remembrance of Katyn involves monuments, cemeteries, memorial sites, official days of commemoration, educational programs, and historical research. The victims are named, honored, and remembered in public space. For Poland, this is essential. Naming is the opposite of disappearance. Naming restores identity. Naming is what the Soviet system tried to prevent through secrecy and denial. Today, each name is a statement that the victims were real people with lives and histories, not anonymous numbers in an archive. But Katyn is also political, and that creates conflict. Political memory is never neutral, especially when it involves responsibility for mass killing. Katyn shapes Polish views of the Soviet period and influences how many Poles interpret the nature of Soviet control after the war. It is a reminder that the Soviet system could use extreme violence against a neighboring nation and then enforce silence for decades. In this sense, Katyn is not only a tragedy. It is evidence of a method of power where state violence is combined with state-managed narrative. At the same time, the way Katyn is discussed in Russia and in Russian political culture has shifted over time and can be unstable. Historical admissions were made and documents were released, but political climates change. States sometimes struggle to accept crimes committed by earlier regimes, especially when those crimes damage national pride or complicate heroic narratives about the Second World War. In some periods, openness increases. In other periods, discussion becomes more cautious, defensive, or emotionally charged. Katyn remains sensitive because it challenges simplified versions of history that portray one side only as victim or only as hero. This sensitivity becomes even stronger because Katyn sits inside the larger memory of the Second World War, which is one of the most emotionally powerful historical periods in Europe. The war was filled with unimaginable crimes committed by Nazi Germany, including genocide, mass executions, and destruction across the continent. Soviet citizens also suffered enormous losses, and the Soviet Union played a major role in defeating Nazi Germany. That reality creates a complex moral landscape. Acknowledging Soviet responsibility for Katyn does not erase Soviet suffering, but it complicates the moral narrative. It forces society to accept that a state can be both a victim and a perpetrator in different contexts. Many political systems prefer simple stories. Katyn refuses to be simple. Katyn also matters because it demonstrates how truth can be manipulated through power. The massacre itself was secret. The denial was official. The archives were sealed. The narrative was controlled. The families were pressured. The topic was censored. This is a textbook example of information control as a continuation of violence. The killing ended in 1940, but the denial functioned as a second assault aimed at memory and dignity. When a state forces people to accept a lie about their dead, it extends the crime across generations. That is why the collapse of denial was so important. It was not only about history, it was about human rights and the right to speak honestly about trauma. In a modern world, Katyn remains relevant because the mechanisms seen in this case still exist in different forms. Secrecy, classification, propaganda, control narratives, and political pressure on historical research. Katyn is therefore studied not only as a tragedy of the past, but as a warning about how states can erase people from history and then attempt to erase responsibility. It shows why independent archives, independent courts, and independent journalism matter. Without them, even the largest crimes can be hidden or reshaped. Katyn also reveals the power of documents. For decades, the strongest evidence was locked away. When archives began to open, denial collapsed. The case demonstrates that memory alone can survive, but documents can force official recognition. That is why archives remain politically sensitive. Whoever controls archives controls the ability to define truth. In Katyn, the archive was the battlefield where the final war was fought. Another reason Katyn remains emotionally charged is that it is tied to questions of justice. Many families wanted more than acknowledgement. They wanted full accounting. They wanted complete lists of victims. They wanted access to all documents. They wanted legal recognition of the crime's nature. Some wanted those responsible named clearly. But state crimes rarely produce perfect justice after decades, especially when political systems have changed and when the perpetrators are long dead. This creates an ongoing sense of incomplete closure. Even when truth is admitted, justice can feel unfinished. In Poland, Katyn continues to influence education and national narrative. It is taught as part of a broader history of occupation, repression, and survival. It is discussed not only as a massacre, but as an example of how Poland's sovereignty was attacked through targeted destruction of leadership. It also shapes Polish attitudes toward external power and historical trust. When a nation experiences both violence and enforced denial, trust becomes fragile. Katyn becomes part of that psychological landscape. Katyn has also become a subject of international historical dialogue. Researchers compare documents, analyze operational structure, and place the crime within the wider context of wartime repression. The case is studied alongside other mass killings, forced deportations, and political executions across Europe. It is a reminder that the 20th century contained multiple systems capable of mass violence, and that the struggle for historical truth often continues long after war's end. What makes Katyn unique in public memory is its combination of elements: a targeted elimination of a national elite, an enormous cover-up, and a decades-long official lie. Many crimes are hidden temporarily. Few are denied as state doctrine for so long. Few become political flashpoints across generations. Katyn did, and that is why it remains a central symbol of the dangers of secrecy and the long-term cost of denial. The final lesson of Katyn is that truth can be delayed, but it cannot be erased completely when evidence survives and when people refuse to forget. Families remembered. Researchers continued. Political systems changed. Documents emerged. And the story returned to the world. Katyn shows that the dead can be buried, but the meaning of their death can still return as a demand for recognition. That demand is not only historical. It is moral. Katyn remains a warning about what happens when state power decides that certain people must be removed from the future. It shows the consequences of treating human beings as categories, as threats, as obstacles. It shows what happens when administrative language becomes a weapon and when silence becomes policy. And it shows why memory matters, because when memory is destroyed, the victims are killed a second time. This is why Katyn is still alive in history. It is alive because it is not only a crime scene in the past. It is an argument about dignity, sovereignty, and truth. It is a reminder that historical justice often has to fight against politics, fear, and propaganda. And it is a warning that the price of denial is not only political tension. The price of denial is the continued suffering of families and nations that were told to forget what they know. Katyn is the story of disappearance, discovery, denial, and admission. But above all, it is the story of how a hidden decision can reshape a nation, and how the fight for truth can last longer than the war itself.